Welcome to our Japanese style living environment webinar series. We'll be in conversation with Bob Hilvers while he constructs tray landscapes. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to our partners who make this programming possible. The Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership for funding, and the Oakland-Fukuoka Sister City Association for production. My name is Peter Boyer, your moderator. I'm pleased to introduce Bob Hilvers. Bob Hilvers will demonstrate making tray landscapes, Sai-kei or Pen-jing, out of stones, trees, and soil. Tray landscapes encompass worlds of wonderment in a very small space. So they are well suited as everyday recreation for modern life, even if time, land, means of travel, or other resources are limited. They're also useful to modeling larger landscape projects. Bob studied with Zhao Qingguan, foremost master of Pen-jing, and author of the leading book on the subject, Pen-jing, Worlds of Wonderment. While crafting tray landscapes before our eyes, Bob will also converse on their history, cultural background, and aesthetics. Bob Hilvers is longtime curator of the Golden State Bonsai Federation Clark Bonsai Collection at the Shinzen Friendship Garden in Fresno, California, USA. The collection is tended by volunteers under Bob's guidance. More info at gsbfclarkbonsaicollection.org.
Okay. All righty. Some of this is new audience. Oh, actually, they can see me. My name is Peter Boyer, and myself and my wife, Dryer, are manning the controls for this webinar on tray landscapes with Bob Hilvers, an expert in the field. So, welcome to the Japanese style living environment tray landscape webinar. This series of webinars on the Japanese style living environment, why? As some of you already know, we feel that the Japanese style living environment is different than most of the rest of us around the world are used to, and therefore there might be something of value to learn from it. So one of the hallmarks of that life is a strong connection to the natural environment. Whether it's just one little tree that recalls your trip to the crest of the mountain, or it's an entire ambitious garden landscape, the feeling it creates inside you should be the same. It should be a high quality, good feeling. So basically we can't live without it. So Bob is going to show us this little known art of tray landscaping, which if you don't have a large plot of land to develop, you see it doesn't take that much. It only needs a tabletop for a balcony at your apartment. So I think that's self-explanatory. Now, this series is produced by the Oakland-Fukuoka Sister City Association. And I'm going to put my mask on now. And sister city associations try to promote world peace through mutual understanding and appreciation among peoples of different cultures. So there's probably a sister city organization in your town, and if not, you can start one. And the hallmark of sister cities associations is exchanges. Junior high students, in the case of Oakland and Fukuoka, we are in Oakland right now. We send junior high students to the Asia Pacific Children's Convention. It's like a United Nations. And high school students come from there, live with your family. You host high school students from another country, and you can send your high school child to another country to have an international experience. This is crucial. We all need to learn how to get along. And it really helps if you're trying to make your way in the world that you're comfortable learning other languages and other customs. And, so that's Sister Cities. We're broadcasting from the Bonsai Garden at Lake Merritt, which is a volunteer-powered, volunteer-funded art display with, of bonsai, now and then a tray landscape, and rocks that evoke natural landscapes called Sai-keis. And this too, as we learned in our morning webinar, is a place where you can come to learn these arts, you can come to appreciate great works of art, and you can grow as a human being, because it's totally natural for human beings to alter their environment or interact with it. And so we're certainly going to see a lot of that in a moment. So you can join a bonsai club, you can join a Sai-kei ornamental rock club, and somewhere between the two, you will be building a tray landscape of your own. And you'll also, as we learned from Kathy Shaner this morning, you'll meet a lot of wonderful people, and you'll build a community, and you'll learn how to accomplish great works like an entire bonsai display garden together. And I really have to think that, any society can't get enough of people who learn how to work in groups and make great things happen. So to introduce Bob Hilvers today, we have Randall Lee, who you'll be hearing a lot more from in late September. Randall Lee is a longtime bonsai practitioner, and he also happens to build tray landscapes now and then himself. And who better to introduce Bob Hilvers and talk about the applications of tray landscape, not just to your living environment, but if you happen to be someone with ambitions in the design field or landscaping, this is like architectural modeling. So there's a lot to be said for tray landscaping, and I think we all ought to do a lot more of it. Randall, would you care to introduce Bob?
Thank you, Peter. My name is Randall Lee. I've crossed paths with Bob Hilvers for almost 20 years. We both have the same disease, bonsaiitis, which we love to grow and collect bonsai. And over so many years, we'd always see each other at fundraisers, demonstrations, bonsai meetings, Golden State Bonsai Federation conventions. Back in 2003, he co-chaired a statewide convention for the Golden State Bonsai Federation, and did such a great job that he eventually became president of the federation. In his spare time, he's also the curator of one of the 3 collections from the Golden State Bonsai Federation, the one in the Shenzhen Friendship Garden in Fresno, California. Shows how talented he is, administrative, art-wise, everything. Back in 2002, fall 2002, I was going to be the program chair for East Bay Bonsai Society, and I was looking for demonstrators for the year of 2003. And I don't remember where I saw Bob's Pen-jing work, but it was really nice. And I said, well, I got to get him to do a demo for our club at East Bay. So we agreed to do that, and I did a great job. And so today he's coming back to do an encore performance. And I'm lucky to have Bob Hilvers performing again his beautiful work of Pen-jing. Bob, take it away.
Thanks, Randall. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to actually explore a wider world of tray landscapes other than just Pen-jing. We're going to do some very sophisticated tray landscaping with Pen-jing, these marble trays. But while we're doing that, we're going to discuss how you can do these for yourself on a very simple basis. So we're going to go from the very sophisticated, using a number of materials, to the everyman's tray landscaping. And we're going to discuss what we're going to need in terms of materials. Unfortunately, we can't have a whole lot of interaction with this particular format, but maybe Randall will help us out a little bit and ask the obvious questions. And get ready? Better? I'm sitting down right now, Peter, because it's easier for me to do this when I get ready to assemble these things. I'll probably have to stand up. Okay.
You're perfect. We can see you and we can see the tray.
Okay, so you're going to need to do these things. You're going to need some basic things. Some of them a little more difficult to obtain than others, and we'll discuss what those are and how to go about them. So basically, you're going to need a tray, a very shallow container, whether it's one of these nice Chinese marble ones that are fairly expensive. The last time I looked on the internet for these, one of this size is about 150 bucks. And they're becoming difficult to find, but they are available. You can also use a regular, this is a small suiban, primarily used to display suiseki, but they will work just as well for tray landscaping. You can use a regular shallow bonsai pot. This particular one has drainage holes in it, so when you use it for tray landscaping, you do need to cover those holes. We'll talk about how to do that. These are small examples too, by the way. These compositions can get quite large. Down at the Huntington, there's some in their Chinese court with trays that are over 2 meters in length. So they can get large, and you can kind of choose what you want. I brought the smaller ones because they're easier to transport. And if you're kind of the object of this particular program, somebody that's recently found the need to enhance their living environment because they're stuck in their apartment or their house due to the COVID-19 restrictions, and longing for a bit of the outdoors, we're going to kind of give you at least one way to bring the outdoors in. And you can use something as simple as this stone slab. In addition to the tray that you need, you will need rocks, because most suiseki and Pen-jing and Bon-kei and Bonseki, on and on, have some aspect of the composition that requires a rock or more than one rock, simply because they give us the impression that this is a natural landscape, and one of the things that we see most naturally in landscapes and have more interesting features than bare dirt are rocks along with the plants. Okay, so it doesn't really matter. Some of the rocks that I have to use do have a rather flat aspect on the bottom of them that makes them easy to set on the tray, but that it's not necessarily so. You don't have to have something that's absolutely flat. Here it is. For the Pen-jing, these require a specific approach to this particular type of Pen-jing. There are 4 of them. The ones that we're going to do today are land and water, which, as the name implies, they're depictions of some interface between a natural environment that has land and water in the composition. The negative space on these slabs represents the water. Even with something like a bonsai suiban that's for suiseki, This one is dark colored rather than light colored, but you still get some negative space. Conceivably, and I've seen these used, the dark ones, for depictions of night scenes, because you use dark elements and you get a kind of a night scene of arrangement. With other kinds of rock plant compositions, particularly those bonsai that are planted over or on a rock, often they're depicted in a very shallow tray to maintain the humidity with the small amount of soil that attaches those things to rocks. And in a Vietnamese version of this art called Honam Bo, the trays normally depict an island, and the water in the tray is not implied with negative space. It actually has water in it, and that's maintained by a circulating system or by someone adding fresh water every day. So there's a wide range of these kinds of depictions used in Asian art to depict landscapes by historical reference. Pen-jing are the first ones that we see depicted as images in some temple murals in China as far as 200 BC. And it seems that those Pen-jing, these tray landscapings, were actually inspired by the larger court landscape, and somebody decided to do one in miniature as a novelty. We're not quite sure exactly how that process came about. So from our earliest human experience, we've been wanting to depict nature in a miniature way so that we could either carry it with us or put it into our directly into our living environment to enjoy. Well, the thrust of this particular program is going to be for you to be able to do one of these things yourselves for your personal pleasure, so that it makes you smile when you walk in the door and see it if you come home from work, or when you get up in the morning and you've got to go to work at the computer in your pajamas, which is the way things are going with most people lately, that you can look over your windowsill and see this, and it maybe make your heart smile a little bit. So this is all about enhancing how you feel, by enhancing your environment, by doing something a little different. And we'll hope to try to keep it as simple as possible for you, so that it doesn't feel like there's so much specialized stuff that you have to have or have to do that this is beyond you. Now, these Pen-jing trays are a little bit of a pain in the ass to do for folks that don't have the right equipment. But you have to have the rocks, the trays, you have to have little plants, okay? You need a little bit of wire. Am I moving out of the, I've got to scoot over here and get some of my goodies, okay? You'll need some glue of some type. I'm using for this particular program some very fast setting glue, so that we can get this done in the time frame of you watching me do it, rather than waiting for the glue to set for a couple hours. We don't have that kind of time frame. So I'm using some fast setting glues, either super glue or something there very like that. In addition to that, we will need to be using some muck to help the plants that we're going to affix in some of these rock locations, and to create little berms as containers for move that up a little bit. And I'm sure that the question about how do I get muck, or where do I get muck if I were going to do one of these things, and curiously enough, you can go on the internet and order muck. I'm not quite sure what the formulation is. In a standard kind of bonsai Japanese way, muck is generally made from akadama dust and peat moss dust. And to protect the roots on the side of a rock, and in some of this case, we're going to do that here. In general, that formulation doesn't have the structural adhesiveness that it takes to do very vertical compositions, and also to hold a rock in place. They're essentially the Japanese style muck is to protect the roots of the plants. This stuff that I'm using, I will be using 2 compositions, and where you get this, other than getting it off the internet, if you can find somebody that sells muck, and there's formulations also on the internet. This particular tub here that I have is formulated from potter's clay, from you know, a block of potter's clay, and long strand peat moss, not the shredded peat moss, but long strand peat moss that I've cut or grated to have it a little bit finer, and some very fine akadama. The reason for this is that it will stay moist and pliable if I apply it to the roots. Also with the moss and a little bit of akadama, there's a method that there's pathways there for plant roots to actually invade this moss and sustain themselves and derive moisture and nutrients from it. Some other types of moss that you might use, and I'm going to show you what those are, don't do that as well. Okay, so this is plain old potter's clay and long strand moss. The other one, I'm going to move out of camera. Oh, here it is. The other clays that you can use for these things is the standard modeling clay that you can go down to your local hobby store and get. This particular one is kind of sticky and it has some elasticity to it, and you can use it for sticking rocks down on flat things and they'll stay. This particular product is air dry. So once the air gets to it, it will start to dry and it will get hard. And it's not exactly what you want to use to encase plant roots with, because they don't have any ability to drive the moisture from this. And once this dries out, then it's pretty hard and it will actually shrink and crack and that sort of thing. I do mix this with a little long strand moss to make it a little friendlier, a little easier to use, so it's not as sticky on my fingers. And so we'll use that later on in the program. I'll show you what the application for that is. You can go down to the toy store and buy child's modeling clay. You'll want to get the brown one or something. You don't want to use the red and green and yellow varieties to make your tray landscaping. But you can also use that material in a certain way for what we call our everyman's tray landscaping we're going to do pretty soon. You'll need some wire in some cases. We'll show you how that gets used. And for specialized anchoring of rocks on vertical surfaces where we need to anchor a wire, there's a method of using super glue and anchoring cement to create an instant bond with the wire, and we don't have to wait around until tomorrow for the wire to get bonded. And we'll use some multi-soil in some cases. So, one last note about some of these rocks. I will say that this one is very flat on the bottom, and that was achieved with a rock saw. We did that on purpose for these land and water Pen-jing specifically, because if you set those flat on the surface, then it takes on the appearance of a rock that's protruding above the water. And there's a very fine demarcation line between the negative space of the tray and where the rock begins. And the only way you can achieve that is by sawing the rock. That's probably outside the realm of most folks' ability, but this is not an impossibility to do. You can rent saws to cut these things. You can take them down. If you're somewhere near a rock shop, you can take it down there and have them cut it for you. I think there might be a question or two about where do you get rocks?
Bob,
Yes.
Can you also take that to a gravestone sawing, place place that makes burial stones?
Yeah, they may be able to. Most of those folks now don't use saws to cut the stone. They use sandblasting machines to and stencils to make the lettering. So you'd have to call and see who had that ability to do that for you. The next question I'm sure is going to come up is, well, where do I get a rock? You know, I'm not encouraging you to go to your neighbor's landscaping and borrow one for this. Rocks are kind of where you find them, and some of them have interesting aspects that seem to lend themselves to these kind of environments. If you notice that these particular rocks all have this kind of fissured weathering appearance to them. And then later on, we're going to use some very large rocks that are dynamic and depict a different environment. But you could pick up plain old round rock, and we'll talk about how to make a round rock incorporated into your tray landscaping so that you don't have to find yourself some sort of Zen special shaped rock out by going on some field trip. Just if you find one that you find that speaks to you and has a nice shape, use it. But it's not necessary that you have these very specific rocks. So what we're going to do next, this tray landscaping has all of the pieces glued down already. We're going to glue one more piece. I'm just using, this is a particular brand, but this is just a version of super glue. And it will adhere the rock wherever we want it to go. Let's say right here, within a few seconds. So we're going to set this one aside for a minute and allow that rock to fix and pick up another one and do some more dramatic stuff. When I get this one done, it's going to be really heavy. And it's a little bit larger tray than the other one. This has already had some tie wires affixed in advance, but with this particular lens, is that camera angle okay?
You know what?
If I'm standing,
probably you're going to stand up now?
Yeah, I'm probably going to stand up for a while. Scoot this over a little bit too. Are we good? Good.
Bob, I thought I'd take this moment to let the audience know that at some point in the show, Bob may be interacting with our two panelists. I forgot to mention that Randall Lee works in a lot of naturalistic garden environments, mostly Japanese-inspired gardens, and occasionally, helps build them. And so he's about over 30 years experience in this regard. And we have another panelist by virtue of the virtual connection, Mr. Tim Hanskin, who builds naturalistic Japanese style gardens in China year after year after year, and some of them are quite grandiose proportions. And this could be a very fruitful interdisciplinary exchange. And they're here more or less at Bob Hilvers' disposal when it comes time for dialogue, and there will be opportunity for question and answer which is best done through the chat control. Move your cursor towards the bottom of your screen. Suddenly you'll see a menu down there, and you can click on the chat thing and type in the chat. It'll, by default, go out to everyone, but you can also send private chats. You don't ask me how that's done. Okay, Bob.
All right. So we're going to put these big, dramatic, heavy rocks on this tray landscaping for a land and water Pen-jing. This is going to be a much different environment than the one that we have here. We have these very jagged, angular rocks with a lot of verticality to them. Suggests one kind of an environment. On the other tray, we have some very smooth, low rock, and we're going to make a much more bucolic environment, simply to provide you a visual contrast of where you can actually go with these things if you choose. So I'll leave my So we're going to end up with this composition. In some cases, I may need to turn this around so I can get my visual bearings, because this will be the front of the composition as you folks out there see it. And I need to kind of get my I'm going to glue these guys to this marble tray and to each other. But to get them to hold in place, while I do that, I'm going to use some of my modeling clay . Now again, this has a different application than the other material in that it will eventually harden and will be antithetical to any root system that you may want. So these are essentially just to kind of get the rocks to stay where we want them at this particular point. That. We have got our basic little rock structure here. We may end up with another little piece here. I don't know yet, probably. This kind of environment just screams dynamic. I mean, we're looking at some kind of alpine or coastal feature. For those of us here in California, this might bring some sort of Monterey Peninsula scene to mind. Ragged Cliff area, maybe. And so we're going to actually put some plants in here that complement that environment, or at least continue the illusion of that environment. And one of them is going to go on the rock right here. So to get that to stick, we have to have something to anchor it. And I'm going to use a little piece of wire. I'm going to have to stick the wire to the rock. I'm going to use copper wire. You can use aluminum. We'll make a little loop here. I'll get it to hold itself. There we go. This is super glue, and I would recommend if you do this, if you use this technique, rather than just finding some epoxy and sticking your wires on the day before instead of the moment of doing some sort of a program. Yeah.
Are these large, tall rocks man-made concrete material
No.
or no?
These are what they call yang rock. They're from China. Actually, they're imported. They come in big 50-kilo sacks for craft supply places. You see them being used for small, what we in bonsai derisively refer to as malsai, where you see these little compositions of a stick juniper and a little rock in a tray in a pot show up at a mall or the big box stores, hardware stores during Christmas time that are dead when you buy them, that kind of thing. But they use these rocks because they have such an evocative kind of features to them. These are commonly glued together with concrete in some of those so that these pieces essentially get assembled the same way that I'm assembling them and sticking them together. They just use mortar and let it dry in the sun.
And use the clay.
Well, I'm using clay to kind of put them where I want them so that I can't stand them there and then they fall over when I turn my back.
Okay.
I'm using the clay to stick them there, and then I'm going to follow it up with an epoxy. And so that's
And
permanent.
we have one more question.
Yeah.
Linda, this last question is Ken. This question is for Linda.
Linda
Berman,
okay.
is the modeling clay you use to stick stones down always water-based or sometimes oil-based?
Well, the oil-based ones will leach oil. The ones that are kind of like from Crayola crayon, they do have an oil base or a wax base to them, and those can leach onto your rocks and give you a greasy look. They can leach into your tray and do the same thing. However, if you cover them with the rocks and the soil and the moss and the stuff that we're going to use today, that doesn't show. The thing about it is that it's very inexpensive It's readily accessible to anybody that wants to do one of these things. And when you get tired of looking at your little composition, or for some reason your little plant dies because you didn't take care of it properly, or for whatever the reason is, then you can disassemble those compositions using those little clay pieces, because you can just take it apart and you're not glued down to anything. This thing, when I get done today, is going to be a permanent part of this tray. They're not going to be separable, not without destroying it. So there are some advantages and disadvantages, but the answer about that little Crayola kind of kids modeling clay is it does have wet wax oil base. Yeah. So I kind of move this over so you can see what I'm doing. Is the other camera pick that up? If it doesn't, that's all right. Okay, I'm putting a little bit of super glue down on this loop of copper wire. A plant to something, a rock in a very vertical composition for rooted on or over rock, and you need to have wire on the rock or some way to attach the plant to the rock. The old-fashioned method was to find a lead sinker or a split shot and pinch the sinker around your wire, and then use a pin, a nail set or something similar, and you drive the lead weight into the crevice on the rock, and that would hold wire. This, we just use a little bit of super glue and a little bit of hydraulic anchoring cement, and they make an instantaneous
So that
bond.
one we didn't get that, so we have to switch camera. So can you show it one more time?
I probably will. Let's take just a few minutes to set.
You can hold up the hydraulic cement now. We got you on the pan cam.
Sure, I mean, this is pretty common at, your big box hardware stores or garden centers. It's just for repairing cracks in driveways and that sort of thing. So it's just a very fine powdery concrete, pure concrete. But you can mix it with the super glue and get an instantaneous bond so that you can attach.
Here's one more question. What is the rock called, the one that comes from China?
This is Ying rock.
Jing?
They call it Ying rock.
J-I-N-G?
Y-I-N-G.
Y-I-N-G,
Bob, is this something similar to what they sell in aquarium stores?
Yeah, you can get this stuff in aquarium stores, not in these very large dimensions, but yeah, you can.
So this is actually several rocks that you put together?
No, this came in these pieces, okay, but this one is all one big piece, yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Buy it at the craft store?
Well, maybe, it's not as readily available as it used to be.
Where to buy the Ying rock?
Yeah.
I don't know. The largest I've seen similar is maybe about this big, maybe about a foot. But this size, I have not seen. So maybe off of the internet or some sellers?
Yeah. There's not anything on the internet that you can't get, legal or otherwise. Okay, so I'm gonna allow that to harden. It's probably set just fine now. But if we put any pressure on it, then I might have to redo it. I don't want to do that. What I'm going to do now is use a fast hardening setting epoxy. To glue the rest of these rocks down. The thing about this is that once you kind of start, you have to stay with it, because if you stop, it plugs up this nozzle, and you won't get another crack at it unless you open up another one. And this is clear.
Oh, good. So it's a fast curing?
Yeah, it's very fast. Almost instantaneous. I'm starting to do it right now.
And it's waterproof?
Yes.
Waterproof, that's great.
I will say that the most super glues are not waterproof. They'll eventually fail. And when you're doing this little mixing the hydraulic cement anchors with super glue, it works better to use the true super glue and not the gel. The gel super glue kind of clots up, and the regular super glue is very runny and liquidy. That infuses that concrete a lot better than the gel does, and you'll get a better reaction that way.
Would you like to know the exact name of that glue that you're just using right now?
This is Loctite epoxy.
Loctite epoxy. It's called Loctite?
Loctite, yeah. Like I say, what I'm using this for is because we're essentially doing this for this particular program. Normally what I would use would be something, this is also a clear, but this is also an instantaneous bonding agent, but it takes about 7 hours to cure.
Hold on, can you show it up one more time?
Just quick hold.
Put it in front of the camera.
It is. You can't see it because you got the
Sure,
check.
but because it's so far away.
I mean, any one of these products, and I'm not advocating something from some manufacturer, any one of these will do. The reason I'm being very specific with what I'm using now is because we're trying to get all of this done within a really short time frame, and I want all of this stuff to stick together instantly.
Do you carry a super glue remover when you're doing this, or you're just very good at not getting on your fingers?
I'm not really worried about it.
So just that bead around the perimeter is enough to hold it, right?
Yeah, it gets pretty strong.
We were setting some large boulders here at the Bonifay Garden at Lake Merritt, and somehow or other we chipped a nice feature right off the edge of one of the boulders. And fortunately, the hardware store half a mile away ran that errand, and we epoxied the piece back on the boulder, and no one's the wiser.
Yep, works great. Okay, back to your view. Now there's our rock composition. We're going to let things kind of cure there for a minute. I'm going to toss this to wherever there's a trash can. I'll just step and set it here, Peter. And I'm going to attempt to move this big giant thing out of the way. And we'll move the other one back in. And so this piece has different rocks, and the rocks are setting the tone for this. One of the things that makes these compositions different from bonsai is that bonsai are essentially designed to give the impression of a tree. They're not in most cases aren't facsimiles. And the kind and style of the tree gives the viewer some notion of the environment involved with that particular tree, but they're individuals. And they're understated intentionally. And they're the star of the show. With these trait compositions, the plants are all play a secondary role. The same thing with the rocks and all of the other environmental pieces. It's the totality of the composition that's telling the story. And in some cases, it's instead of the implied sublimeness of bonsai, these things are expressed. I mean, everything's right there. That's a rock. There's no, there's no implying that a rock was there where this tree grew over it in a canyon somewhere. It's sitting right there. And the little plants are right there because little plants go with rocks. And there may be sand and bushes and grass and all sorts of other things that you would associate to go with that particular environment. And then they may even have figurines in them. which for purist bonsai is enough to make us all retch, right? But these things are a different composition. They're not actually are not bonsai. They're a different breed of cat altogether. And they're there for a different reason. And we make the compositions for different reasons. So in this case, instead of this dynamic coastal seaside scene where there's storms and constant uplifting from plate tectonics that are creating these huge coastal cliffs and storms and wave action that are degrading the rocks on a daily basis, we're going to turn now to an environment where things have kind of already slowed down quite a bit. So we're going to be, rather than the edge of the ocean, we're going to be at the edge of a stream or maybe a small lake. And we see these rocks are not all sharp and vertical. They're low and weathered, and they have nice little cracks in them, and that all gives the feeling that this is a much more bucolic environment. And so we're going to use bucolic kinds of plants rather than a conifer or something of that nature. We're going to use maple. So all of these little pieces here that you see are just tie wires that I put on yesterday and make sure that the glue was cured. This piece that we just did a few minutes ago with the super glue now is stuck down. Okay. So to complete this scene, okay, with the rocks, we need some trees, we need some dirt, we need some grass. Okay. And so we end up with this very peaceful composition that all of the pieces are complementary. So I don't need this piece anymore. I
And
don't
how
know.
did you glue down the wires?
You know, the same way that I showed you.
Okay.
Okay, I just use a different glue that takes longer. Easier to apply, easier to use. Now here's where I need my other muck that is root friendly. So we wanted to kind of classify these into something that's not very root friendly and something that is root friendly. So in this particular instance, we're going to use this stuff to make a little berm around where our plants are going to go. And this stuff is kind of sticky. But it's water soluble also, so I can just wash it off.
Well, can you go into how you went about designing your stone arrangement?
Well, it's a purely personal kind of, you know, what tickles your fancy kind of a thing. I did spend a fair amount of time with Brooke Zhao when he was in the States a few years ago. And we had some chances to talk about compositions and how they get used. And so the purpose for this one, among other things, Kathy, was to offer the range of compositions that you could depict. And so I intentionally picked a bucolic one and a very dynamic one, you know, at opposite ends of a kind of a spectrum kind of a thing. Does that answer the question very much? I guess not.
No, it does, yeah. And then, so it's appealing or mood you want, but I guess it's like, you have to envision it, it's like, how do you actually go about, in what order do you place your stone?
Well, we're going to talk about, you know, this one is fairly sophisticated. I've done a bunch of these way back when, and I haven't done one of these in 20 years maybe. But I have a whole bunch of them at the Huntington, and was doing them pretty regular for club demonstrations and that sort of thing. But the other factor in determining, you know, what compositions I would use is when Peter first contacted me, he said, "Can you do a Pen-jing for me?" And really what he wanted me to do was a bunch of landscape trays that included Sai-kei and Pen-jing and the other things. I didn't catch on to that for a while. Thank you. I have some paper towels right here. So to kind of keep answering the question that maybe have already been answered is why these? These are the ones I had the rocks for.
Where did the maple come from, Randall? Did you bring the maple?
No, I didn't think.
Did you bring the maple stuff?
Yeah.
How long did you have to make maples like that?
I actually went out to Ed Clark's and got these maples last week.
Where's Ed Clark's nursery located at?
It is in Round Valley, just above Exeter, California. He's a good guy.
That's outside of Fresno, right?
It's pretty far south of Fresno, actually.
Very far south.
I live in Visalia, and it's about 45 minutes to Ed's place from my house.
Oh,
And I'm up at about 55 minutes south of Fresno. So, I see that some of my bougainvillea is taking up residence in the back of these.
Well, I was just gonna ask you, is that a bougainvillea in there?
Yeah, it is.
It's really pretty, I mean.
Some fall color
I thought
there.
it was a building. No, I thought it was. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, it is.
It's part of my little candy
I
stripe
thought it was a
bougainvillea.
little bougainvillea that you planted in there too.
My little candy stripe bougainvillea that's on my patio. So, I think I need some sticks. Thank you, sticks. Bamboo sticks.
You use the smaller size structures?
I kind of tended to start making my own chopsticks out of bamboo. They wear well. I can, they're stronger. I can put the edge on them that I want to for the kind of work I'm doing, so that I just can modify them. So I just get a big piece of timber bamboo, and that'll pretty much last me for a good long period of time.
Let us know if you need more.
Now we've got it stacked in the rafters at the CBC. What I'm making right now,
Did we trim the hoofs of my horse after the show?
are some, stop that. You can go right there. So I'm going to use my tire wires to come across these little bamboo pieces to hold down the root systems of these maples. And then I can trim them for need. I'm going to cover all of this with moss. Of course, then again, when you put the tie wires on, you do kind of have to anticipate where your plants are going to go. So if that makes anybody kind of think that I put this all together before and then took it apart for this program, the answer is yes.
Oh, okay.
So that I can dazzle you folks with feats of a leisure domain. I do have what you folks would call senior moments. What I kind of consider it as are moments when the CPU just kind of stops computing for a few minutes. So this is where the muck comes into its own, because I can put it right up against this muck. I can put it right up against the roots, and it won't air dry and then take the roots with it. There's enough other organic material in the form of long strand sphagnum moss and a little bit of tiny size akadama for the roots to find pathways in there and sustain themselves. Does that make sense? I guess it does if I say so.
It's akin to something municipalities are using called engineered soil
Yeah,
to allow street trees some ground to explore in an otherwise compacted environment.
essentially the same process, yeah. It just makes a difference on how you construct them up. Normal Japanese keto muck does that exceedingly well. This just has a little more stickiness to it than that material does. And so it works a little better for offering structural kinds of strength. And it stays sticky. And so you're looking at this and saying, my God, Bob, other than those poor folks that are having to look at the top of my head. That's ugly. I mean, that's really ugly. Really ugly.
Need some more paper?
I'm getting there. Now we need some of this stuff. This is plain old garden variety moss. And moss, like the rocks, is where you find it. This particular moss came from the floor of the greenhouse at the CBC.
That would be the Clark Bonsai Collection
Yes.
at Shenzhen Friendship Garden in Fresno, California.
Yes. Sorry about that.
Speaking of which, you mentioned the Huntington.
Yeah.
Tell us a little more about both of these institutions.
Well, they're both, like this particular collection here at Lake Merritt, owned by the Golden State Bonsai Federation, and their mission is to expose and bring the art of bonsai to the citizens of California and the world. So we tend to consider ourselves bonsai museums because our artifacts are designed to educate folks and enlighten folks about the art history and cultural significance of bonsai. In California, we have a very rich, I'm going to sit down here for a minute. That's probably going to change your camera. Tradition with bonsai. And because we have artists still living that were practicing the art in almost what we would call camera. They did it without traditional materials and access to traditional teachers and tools. And we've simply moved on as a culture since then, but all things Japanese were suppressed prior to and certainly after, during and after World War II. So the guys and gals that did bonsai back in those days did the best they could with the materials they had at hand. And in some cases, the bonsai that they produced are of a recognizable, if it's not style, certainly a recognizable approach to doing bonsai. One notable Japanese American bonsai artist once told me that they did bonsai from what he called the benign neglect, which I thought was pretty apt about description about how some of those guys actually got their trees to be miniature, which goes to leaving to the elements. But it's if you've seen enough of those particular kinds of bonsai, you can recognize them as being immediately post-war Japanese American bonsai. And there are a few places, if any, that are maintaining that art work. And here and at the Clark Bonsai Collection are two of them. So now I'm doing the fun stuff. When it starts to look like something, because I've got what in our mind makes us think of as grass growing in this little copse of trees. This muck that I'm using is very friendly to this stuff, so it will not only stick to it, but give it a happy home.
Would you care to comment on the adaptability of moss as a plant, as a ground cover in different kinds of climates? It must be tough out there.
Well, and where I live, from the Central Valley right now, we're in our 6th day, I think it is, of a 10-day triple-digit run, which is pretty normal for our neck of the woods for this time of the year. We'll see triple digits now for the remainder of the summer. And not only is it a kind of a challenge for us to to keep the plants hydrated in those kinds of circumstances where there's just huge amount of heat. In the summer, especially around our neck of the woods, since we don't have a whole lot of like coastal marine air layers that shield the trees from the ultraviolet light, that we get extreme ultraviolet overexposure during the end of August or the end of July and beginning of August, and that stops the plant's metabolism. So we get these trees that are getting so much sunlight that they've kind of gone into a summer dormancy. When they do that, they're not transpiring water very efficiently. So we can water the bejesus out of them and they still get brown and sick and weak and don't do well. So we have to modify our soil mixes so that we can give them a little bit more efficiency in water use during this time of the year. And even so, we just have to be extremely vigilant regarding our watering regime.
Could you expand on the difference in a water on a tray or versus a pot versus the land?
Well, the watering regime for one of these as opposed to a bonsai, you mean?
Yeah.
Essentially, it's not a whole lot different, okay? This has no drainage holes, but the tray is so shallow that capillary action of the trees using the water and not dehydration, but evaporation will not allow the roots to sit in water and rot. But then again, they dry out very quickly. So this would have to be, at least in our environment, have to be watered every day.
In a tray, there's no provision for leaching salts out the exit hole in the bottom of the pot. How does one prevent that
Well,
foliar burn that comes from fertilizers?
my sympathies go to you if you have soils or waters that have so much salts in them that they're leaving residue on your plants or depositing in your leaves. If you're getting that from fertilizing, then you're fertilizing at the wrong time and too much. The plants will use it, and then if they don't use it, now there can be a situation where there is salts in the soil beyond your control, and that will end up, especially in plants like these maples, it'll end up in the leaves, and then when the sun shines on the leaves, it'll cook the margin. It'll actually just cook the leaf. That happens in alkali soils pretty often. Back when the Clark collection was at the Clark Museum, the water out there was alkaline. So we had to have a reverse osmosis system that would remove all of that stuff. And when we did, the plants went cuckoo. They thought they died and gone to heaven. And before that, they're in the summertime, particularly the maples, it looked like we sprayed gasoline on them.
Do you spray them with spray bottle or do you just put
Either way,
like water in it?
either way. We have our kind of happy little, very sleepy, fishermen at the edge of a stream or a little pond.
Those who are new to this mode of design, did you say you were gonna, at the end, talk about the composition as a whole?
Well, when we practice these tray landscapes as opposed to bonsai, we're in the bonsai and how the bonsai is crafted, and it offers us an opportunity to imagine the landscape that particular tree came out of. The obvious ones would be a windswept type of tree or something where there's these really dynamic forces on it. But we can look at some styles of bonsai and imagine that the only place we're going to see a cascading tree is on the side of a cliff somewhere. We're not going to see that in a pasture. So just the kinds of styles within bonsai conjure up certain images. With tray landscaping, there's no conjuring of images. It's right in your face. I mean, it's all right there, and it's intended to be that way. That's why we use such small, insignificant kinds of plants for these tray landscapings. Because with bonsai, they're individuals, they're a singularity. All of the imagery has to come through from that one item. Where these things are these combination items, and the story is being told with all of the elements, and the trees are not the star of the show. They're supporting actors, and if they were the star of the show, they wouldn't serve this as well as something that's not. Also, it's unimaginable to see a figurine in bonsai, but it's perfectly acceptable, in fact expected, with these kinds of things. With bonsai, man's role within nature is implied. He's there. Certainly with most bonsai, the implication is that they were crafted by the hand of a man. It's almost necessary to do that. It's especially nowadays, the styles that are winning the big awards are so well prepared that of course somebody's touched those. Natural trees don't grow that way, and so it's implied that way. And in nowadays, even almost it has to be, or they're not going to win much of a prize. These things, it's the other way around. It's almost a reverse. If you don't depict mankind's presence either through individuals or through animals or through dwellings or some sort of structure, man-made structure, they're kind of barren. They need that presence.
I'll tell you, the figurine sets the scale.
It does also. Yeah, there is that part of it. Okay, so I'm going to try to move this out of the way.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to get a picture of it here with the camera. Yeah, we're back to
So,
People want to see it from the front.
oh, okay. I'm going to scoot it over there. Randall, if I hand this to you, can you? So now we go from this sleepy little stream to this very dynamic seaside cliff arrangement, if I can lift it. And so the story is here is, man, who's telling the tale here? If you look at this, it's the rocks. The rocks are the star of the show. Okay. We could get a very dynamic tree, a bonsai, with lots of movement and deadwood in this, to put on this composition and come up with something pretty stunning. But then again, that would change it from a tray landscaping to a bonsai, where the bonsai is the star of the show. Okay? And the rocks are simply supporting elements into why this tree has such a dynamic trunk and scarring and weathering associated with it. Okay. So for this, we're going to use very simple little conifers.
Ah,
because conifers are, we do, and the human mind associates conifers with this kind of an environment of some sort, whether it's a pine or a cypress. This is a conifer environment. There's a big gap in the back here between these rocks, and I'm just filling it in with muck, which is a traditional sort of use for muck with on rocks. And I'm kind of building up this pretty vertical wall in between these rocks. And that's not possible with normal kettle unless it has a clay component to it, which is what this has. Trees that I'm using for these little junipers are meant to represent some sort of sea conifer, whether that's a pine or some other kind of conifer plant. And they don't have a whole lot of dynamic movement, and they're pretty straight little trunks, and I chose those intentionally. Because actually, if you see these little cliff scenes and off the coast of China, where you see these very dynamic island rocks out there, the trees on them are pretty straight. If we were to be using this as a bonsai, we'd have some really dynamic little changes, abrupt changes in trunk angles and stuff. So I'm going to turn this around so I can get to see the front of the composition and the position of this little tree, about where we might want it to be. Watching some of this kind of stuff on a live stream broadcast is a whole lot like sitting at home watching paint dry. And I kind of apologize for that, but this is how it has to go.
Perfect.
This is just grated, you know, it's a plastic grate that serves as drainage, full screen for bonsai. This particular one is not the most desirable. It's a fabric craft product. You can get them at the fabric stores and the craft stores. And it's made to do needlepoint, that sort of thing. It really doesn't have as good a performance as the specialty made bonsai screen stuff, but it works. Yeah, works in a pinch. What I'm doing now is making a little dam, little soil dam. To put another tree on this rock. Right there. Muck. Clay muck. This is the little anchor that we did for the side of this thing with the super glue.
Yeah.
I don't think we want to do that. Too much work. So we're about 10 seconds away from doing the fun stuff. great thing about this clay-based kettle is that you don't need to use little wire clips or something else to hold it in place. It just sticks. Makes my job easier. So we can just go around the composition here and imagine that in this environment, particularly in those really iconic photographs we see of the South China Sea, where we have these high vertical rocks just sticking straight up out of the ocean, and the tops of them are just covered with moss. And we can replicate that pretty easily. I put in this moss in these crevices. Now, what will happen is that in about a day and a half, that moss will all dry up. Unless you have a greenhouse and you've got these things exposed to constant moisture. Then it will stay. In my neck of the woods, where we can regularly take a Japanese maple, let's say August 15th, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, set it out on the bench and time it about 15 minutes, it'll burst into flame. I'm being facetious. It gets hot and the sun is bright.
I know I almost had a heat stroke there in Fresno.
Well, it can happen. It does happen. What's our time?
Yeah.
Well, we've got one more to do.
So everyone's back from break. Maybe you should just run through those questions from chat and raise hands one more time, because I think half the people weren't there when we looked at it.
I'm ready. I was born ready. Get the horses.
Okay, so there's questions.
Okay.
With this school of seascape in Pen-jing, do you ever use sand around the base
Yes.
of the cliffs to mimic breakers?
Yes. Yeah, not only to mimic breakers, but actually to mimic pebble beaches. So in this particular composition, conceivably, we could put a beach or a low tide composition between these two rock outcroppings and create a little bit of a dry space beach right there, if we wanted to. So it's all personal preference. And so if somebody had this composition and they wanted to put that there, that would be pretty conceivable. Other kinds of complementary and scale inducing pieces that you see common to these very dynamic and vertical angular rocks are small boats. This particular one has a couple of seabirds.
Zebras?
Seabirds, right here.
Oh, seabird, I have. So,
Got it?
Got it.
Did we answer Leanne's question?
Yeah, just said it was black.
So we're done with questions, we're good to go?
Yep.
Okay,
There you go.
last little composition that I kind of refer to as the everyman Sai-kei or tray composition. You don't have to have expensive marble trays or even a Japanese pot or a small suiban. You can use a flat piece of stone. These are readily available as stepping stones in garden centers and big box stores, Rockworks. You can get them. You can get them on the internet. You can get plaster ones made to look like flat stones. So they're available. This one would be available to anybody that want to spend a little bit of time going to a garden center or some sort of stone rockery. I don't want to speak for the store, what they would sell it to you at the pound, or might just give you something. So this is like available for no cost. Rocks. Okay, I've got a couple of rocks here. They're not sawed. This one just happens to have a flat aspect to it and I kind of thought they were interesting little rocks. And so I happened to have them in my pile of rocks when I got ready to do this thing. You don't need to have one like this. You can have any kind of a rock that you want that we're going to set up in some kind of composition here. Okay, and I can get my little modeling clay here, not my keto, not my muck, but my modeling clay.
Somebody asked a question. Mock is potter's clay, long stranded peat moss, and
Water,
water. Okay.
so you get a consistency kind of like meatloaf. You mush it around with your hands the same way you do meatloaf. If you make meatloaf like I make meatloaf. So I'm not going to glue these rocks down. I'm just going to use my little modeling clay to stick them down. So no specialized stuff. This I think is less than $5 for a package of it at Michael's or wherever you like to get your stuff, your hobby stuff, craft stuff. And I'm going to stick this rock down. It's not going to go very far. Okay. And I'm going to use this little tree. This is a simple little bonsai. It's made from a juniper that you can buy when they're on sale at Home Depot or Lowe's or any of those kinds of places. They normally in the spring when everybody gets bit by the get out in their yard and re-landscape stuff, they sell these little junipers for a couple bucks. So these are available to you for low cost.
When do you just comb the soil from between the roots, and when do you decide to, there's just too many roots and you need to cut them?
Well, but these little guys like this one, and they have this sheen, Japanese for the heart of the root system. They're pretty durable because there's a whole lot of fibrous roots right in there, and you can get pretty ruthless with them as long as there's plenty of foliage on them. Where they get their vigor actually is from the foliage, not the roots. These guys, okay? Others not so much, but these guys. And so we can, fortunately, pretty much do what we want to a degree. You know, I can't cut them completely off, but there's enough roots to keep this guy going.
And we had a great discussion with Kathy Shaner about the multiple variables involved in any move. So just because one species gets this treatment,
Yeah,
doesn't mean
that's exactly right.
time of the year, your geographic location, and more.
No question. Understanding what you're doing and the limitations of the species that you have helps.
Oh, what's that again?
Bonsai soil.
What is that?
Bonsai soil.
Bonsai.
Bonsai.
Yeah, bonsai. Bonsai actually is the word right. What? Bonsai is a miniature tree. Okay.
No, I didn't understand a thing.
The trivia for you, Randall. What does bonsai actually mean? Translated. It is, yeah. It does have a meaning.
I don't even know Mandarin, I don't know Japanese either, so.
It has absolutely no meaning for us. As if Monday Night Football would have a meaning for a 12th century samurai. But it means 10,000 lives. Kind of like when these guys were lining up before some battle, that is a samurai, the feudal samurai. They wouldn't fight just any time. They had to fight after the planting and before the harvest. You know, we're not going to interfere with the good stuff in life, right? And so they would find some level piece of ground, which is pretty difficult in Japan, actually, being as mountainous as it is. And they'd send some message to the next guy over, the next province over, that they had beef with, and invite them to, you know, battle, and then show up there with their team, wherever it was happened to be, and they'd stand across the field from each other and hurl insults at each other, yell at each other. You know, your dog's ugly, and that kind of stuff. And then when they made themselves mad enough at each other to go at it with big knives, big, sharp cleaver side swords. They'd yell bonsai or bonsai, which means that 10,000 lives are going to get lost here today, and you are going to be one of them.
And how does that translate into trees? Into miniature trees?
I think it's because the two words just sound similar.
Well, bonsai is actually a combination of two words, yeah, that mean a tree in a tray or tree in a dish. Bonsai. So, in a few minutes, with very simple, inexpensive materials, there's an everyman Sai-kei. Simple rock slab, some simple rocks that you kind of like, an inexpensive plant, and we have a Sai-kei. Okay, we're done. I'm out of bullets.
Yeah, all right. If you're modest, Bob, this is Peter Boyer. I should like to say that all three of these compositions have a lot of movement and unusual forms of balance. The first two we saw had a lot of height on the left side and went down towards the right, and the left side tended to be full of rock and tree, and the right side was more like a void of water with a few more outlines of rocks. And this last one, the tree is out and then cascading down to the left, but the rock seems to spiral forward to the right corner. It's just, you know, my eye likes to move around and explore. It's far from static, and they all seem to be balancing one another. Mass balancing void, lots of lines of light.
We can have a discussion about negative space in each of these three compositions. Okay. Give my pickup a turn here. So, we can't really, can we get them all three in? So this first composition was this very dynamic environment, which we intentionally designed that way. There is, of the three compositions, the most negative space. And so we might have a discussion, if we were going at this as an art project, of what play the negative space has on the composition. Does it enhance the composition? Does it detract from the composition? Does it play into what our expectations of these relationships would be in the natural world? If we had this somewhere on our patio or within our living environment, would this make us smile? Would this make us feel good? Does the negative space actually contribute to the composition? With this other Pen-jing, we have the least negative space, considering that the rock planting is a Sai-kei and not a Pen-jing.
Oh, we're still at that one.
Oh,
We have to change the camera because we wanted to show it.
Okay, we're at number 2, Bob.
well, number 2 has less negative space by far in terms of how much percentage of space in the entire composition is devoted to nothing. Does that work for this piece? Does it accentuate the feeling of this piece? Does it complement the overall composition? Or does the fact that it has less negative space detract from this composition? Or does this amount of negative space meet our unintended or our subconscious expectations of how this should look? In other words, do we look at this and say there's something off about that? Or do we look at this and say this composition is harmonious? Would more negative space work for this piece? Would less negative space work for this piece? So in terms of whether this is a good pinching or whether you like this pinching or whether this is a bucolic environment as opposed to a dynamic environment, the negative space that a composition has in it, whether it's a bonsai or a pinching or anything else, has meaning. It defines the positive space. A lot of that discussion nowadays gets done about bonsai when it didn't used to be, but it is now. Because if you don't have negative space, you don't have definition of branch structure or pads or the angularity or the verticality or the extending branch or a contracting branch that brings the eye back into the center of the composition, something that extends out and takes the eye away from the center of the composition. All of those kinds of discussions are being done now when they didn't used to be about bonsai and pinching as well. So what's the verdict? Do we need more negative space, or is that just about right?
So, Leanne wants to ask you a question.
Okay.
Go ahead, Leanne.
Oh, no, I didn't have a question. I'm not sure why I was unmuted.
Sorry.
sorry.
Your hand. All right, no problem.
Well, you can still ask a question. No, I don't have a whole lot of money. Yes, I'd like to have a beer.
Where are we taking them to dinner?
I'm way too dry.
Somebody would like to say, could we put boats there?
Put what?
Boats.
Oh, yes. With these, especially with these
Linda Berman.
these vertical kinds of reaching compositions with these very angular rocks, canyon scenes, or seaside scenes, frequently you do see a boat there somewhere in the composition. Yeah.
Actually, I do have a question for Bob. How difficult is this to take care of once you do these tray landscapes?
Well, they're not a whole lot different than having a bonsai, which is not unlike having a puppy. They require care and feeding. These compositions, because there's not much soil in them, require daily watering. They do, because the plants that we're using here are hardy plants or semi-hardy plants. They do better outside than they would indoors. These are not indoor plants that we're using in either of these compositions. Okay, so that presents problems depending on your climate. So if you have a nice morning sun-exposed place that gets afternoon shade, and you're in a position to either water these daily or have a system that will water these daily, you'd be okay. But they do require daily watering.
Let's answer the other question, okay? And Hiromi loves the piece you just finished. Thank you for showing it off done. So that's Hiromi, that's, I guess, that small one, the last one.
Say again?
She loves it. I mean, I think everybody probably loves it, but she says bravo. They say bravo.
Thank you.
That's milk too.
Thank you.
You want a second one? Want to go home with?
What plants would you use for an indoor composition?
That's a good question, because some of them, there aren't very many house plants that lend themselves to a woody structure like to depict a tree. But that doesn't mean that you have to have a tree landscape. You could have a shrub landscape, and just about anything that will survive as a house plant can be used as a Pen-jing or a Sai-kei. For a woody structured plant, boxwoods will survive indoors if they get plenty of light. Sarissa, Petita will do okay. Some azaleas will do okay. But the operative thing that you need to keep in mind is, even if it's a tropical plant that's designed to live in environments of low light, most houseplants come from some sort of environment under a very dense tree canopy. And the reason they do okay in houses is they get very little light. But regardless of whether it's a semi-tropical or tropical, some sort of quote unquote houseplant, they will always do better outside. So if they're starting to look a little peak at indoors, outdoors, little fresh air helps them out. One of the things that we don't keep in mind or aren't aware of is that in our climate controlled homes, the humidity is less than it is at the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert has a humidity of about 20%. Most modern climate controlled homes have a humidity of 15%. And so the plants react accordingly. Also, if a plant looks like it's not getting enough sunlight, people tend to compensate for that by putting it closer to the window. Because of course, closer to the window means more sunlight, right? What happens when they do that is that they're actually exposing the plant to a whole lot more heat than they are light. Because there's more heat that's coming through the glass than there is sunlight. And then the plant gets cooked. And then finally, for all of those nice ladies out there that have walked up to me at the Clark Bonsai Collection or one of the bonsai functions somewhere and say, I love those things, I just can't keep them alive. And I ask them without with understanding, knowing the answer before I ask it, is where do you keep that thing? Well, I like to look at it, so I put it on my TV. And I ask, do you ever water it? What? Water will get on the TV. But how do I keep my bonsai looking green? Can spray paint.
We don't have too many big old-fashioned TVs anymore, however, so we have fewer plants that are dying because they're on the TV. They're on the, you know.
And most of the people that would have one of those things aren't keeping bonsai anymore either.
Good point, Kathy Gaynor. Good point. How about a full cascade off of a wall-hung LCD TV? But anyway. All right. So I want to thank Bob Hilvers for dusting off the tray landscaping presentation. It was just smashing. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm glad that Hiromi-san was watching from New York City, and to all our other audience members, I want you to know that there's a feature in your toolbar at the bottom of your screen where you can invite a friend. If you're watching one of these and you think it's really terrific, you can somehow navigate from there to emailing them a link to the event that you're watching. That's always fun. And we can all talk about it afterwards too. There's more, and most of you know, you've seen the full lineup of 6 presentations. Coming up on the Saturday, the 29th of July, I believe, we're going to have retired Professor Frank L. Champ. He is a Asian arts scholar and widely traveled there. And well, you can read his bio on the class lineup. But he's going to do a survey of the evolution of architecture in Japan. I'm going to take this down for a second. And so the architecture of Japan is just as important to the living environment as the out of doors or the art pieces that we bring indoors or display outdoors. And you'll notice that it's difficult to separate from the entire integrated environment. And that's kind of the point of this series. But we're going to focus on the built architecture, the homes and offices and other dwellings. And he's going to take you on a long journey through time. And he'll be followed shortly thereafter on the 2nd of August by a traditional joinery carpentry master named Jay Van Arsdale. So perhaps if there's any further questions, you can always contact us about this Japanese style living environment class series via the following email address: jpnliven@gmail.com. Suggestions are welcome. Feedback.
Thank you, Bob Hilvers, for an engaging presentation. Thanks to the original webinar audience for their provocative questions and shared knowledge. The conversation afforded the chance to imbibe the lecture information and form connections with like-minded people. And thank you to the Japanese people who over generations developed the life and living environment that's subject of these webinars, and who generously shared this gift with the world. Thanks to the many artists, craftsmen, authors, and organizations worldwide and here in the USA who've made this known, notably the North American Japanese Garden Association, NAJCA, Bonsai and Suiseki Clubs, Japan-US Sister City Associations, and Tsukiya Living Magazine, which shows and tells how the Tsukiya living environment's intangible essence may be realized all over the world with a diversity of tangible materials and forms. Thanks to the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership for financial support. Thanks to the Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association for producing these webinars. We invite you to view other recorded webinars in the Japanese Living Environment webinar series. Thank you and see you next time.